The flames licked at the edges of Kimberly Jones's cornfield like hungry tongues, orange and yellow against the darkening sky. She stood on her porch, watching 20 years of careful cultivation turn to ash and smoke. Behind the wall of fire, she could see them, 5 men on horseback, silhouetted against the destruction they had wrought. Richard Morgan sat his mount like a king, surveying his domain, his silver hair catching the firelight as he gestured toward her modest farmhouse. "You had your chance, woman," Morgan called across the crackling flames. "Should have taken my offer when it was generous." Kimberly said nothing. Her weathered hands rested on the porch railing, steady as stone. The fire would burn itself out against the irrigation ditches she had dug in a careful pattern around her property. The men did not know this yet. They thought they had her trapped, thought the flames would drive her out like a rabbit from its warren. They were wrong about many things. Eugene Nelson, Morgan's lieutenant, urged his horse closer to the fire line. "The woman's probably halfway to town by now, boss, running scared." Morgan shook his head. "She's still there. I can feel it. Stubborn as a mule, this one." The flames began to die as they reached the hidden water channels, exactly as Kimberly had planned. Steam rose in white clouds, and through the haze she could see the confusion on their faces. The fire that was supposed to flush her out was instead revealing the careful engineering of her defenses. Brandon Adams pointed at the water, his voice carrying across the distance. "How did she know to dig those trenches there?" Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take a turn these men never saw coming. But to understand how Kimberly Jones came to face 5 armed men with nothing but her wits and 20 years of buried secrets, we need to go back. Back to 3 weeks earlier, when her life was still the quiet existence of a widow trying to make her way in the Nebraska territory of 1878. The morning had started like any other. Kimberly rose before dawn, as was her habit, and walked the perimeter of her 160-acre homestead. The corn was coming in well this year, tall green stalks rustling in the pre-dawn breeze. She checked the irrigation channels she had spent years perfecting, a network of ditches and channels that could flood or drain her fields as needed. Most folks thought it was just good farming. They did not know it was also a defensive system. Her boots made soft sounds on the packed earth as she completed her circuit. Everything was as it should be. The chickens were stirring in their coop, and her milk cow, Bessie, was already waiting by the barn gate. This land was everything to her now. After her husband Thomas died 5 years ago, it was all she had left of their life together. She was drawing water from the well when she heard the hoofbeats. 5 riders coming up the long dirt road that led to her house. Kimberly straightened slowly, her hand unconsciously moving to the small of her back where, years ago, she would have carried a weapon. The gesture was automatic, muscle memory from a life she had left behind. The riders were well dressed. Not the rough cowboys or drifters who sometimes pass through. Their leader was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of authority. He wore a black coat despite the summer heat, and his horse was a fine bay gelding that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "Morning, ma'am," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. "Richard Morgan's the name. I represent certain business interests in the territory." Kimberly nodded politely. "Mr. Morgan, what can I do for you?" Morgan smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Direct. I like that in a person. Truth is, ma'am, your land sits right in the path of some development we have planned. Railroads coming through, and well, progress waits for no one." "I see," Kimberly said, "and you are here to make me an offer I can't refuse." "Smart woman." Morgan gestured to one of his men, who produced a leather portfolio. "We're prepared to offer you $500 for your homestead. That's more than fair for land this far from town." Kimberly looked at the papers without taking them. "This land is worth 10 times that, and we both know it." Morgan's smile faded slightly. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but the railroad is coming whether you sell or not. Might be better for everyone if we can work something out peaceful-like." The threat was polite but unmistakable. Kimberly had heard similar words before, in different circumstances, from different men. The tone was always the same. "Submit or suffer the consequences." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Morgan," she said calmly, "but this land isn't for sale." Eugene Nelson, the man to Morgan's right, leaned forward in his saddle. Lady, you don't understand. This isn't really a negotiation. Kimberly's eyes shifted to Nelson, taking in his gun belt, the way he held his reins, the slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was more nervous than he wanted to appear. She cataloged these details automatically, the way she had been trained to do long ago. I understand perfectly, she said. You're trying to steal my land. The answer is no. Morgan held up a hand to silence Nelson. Mrs. Jones, isn't it? I've heard you're a reasonable woman. Lost your husband a few years back, trying to work this place alone. That can't be easy. Thomas and I built this place together, Kimberly replied. I'm not walking away from it. Morgan studied her for a long moment. You know, ma'am, accidents happen out here. Fires, mostly. Terrible thing when a person loses everything they've worked for. Kimberly met his gaze without flinching. Is that a threat, Mr. Morgan? Just an observation about the hazards of frontier life. The five men sat their horses in silence for a moment, waiting for her to break, to show fear, to negotiate. When she did neither, Morgan gathered his reins. We'll be back in 3 days, Mrs. Jones. I suggest you use that time to reconsider our generous offer. They rode away without another word, leaving Kimberly standing by her well. She watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then walked calmly into her house. But once the door was closed behind her, she moved with sudden purpose. In the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, Kimberly knelt beside their old trunk. She had not opened it in 5 years, not since the day she buried her husband and decided to leave her old life behind. Her fingers found the hidden catch, and the false bottom of the trunk lifted away. Inside was a leather gun belt, worn smooth by years of use. A Colt 45 with custom grips, cleaned and oiled despite years of storage. A silver badge, tarnished now, with the words United States Marshal etched in its surface. And beneath it all, a letter of commendation signed by the territorial governor, praising Marshal Kimberly Hawthorne for her service in tracking down the notorious Dalton gang. Kimberly Hawthorne. She had not used that name in 8 years, not since she married Thomas Jones and retired from law enforcement. But the skills that had made her one of the most feared marshals in the territory had not faded. They had only been sleeping, waiting for a moment like this. She strapped on the gun belt, feeling its familiar weight settle on her hips. The Colt felt like an old friend in her hand as she checked the action, muscle memory taking over. 6 shots, perfectly balanced, accurate to 100 yards in the right hands. Her hands. That evening she walked her property again, but this time with different eyes. Not the eyes of a farmer checking her crops, but the eyes of a marshal planning a defense. The irrigation ditches that helped her corn grow could be flooded to create barriers. The root cellar could serve as a fallback position. The barn provided good sight lines to the road and high ground for a rifleman. She had hoped never to need these skills again. But Richard Morgan had made a mistake. He had threatened her home, the life she had built with Thomas, the only thing she had left to remember him by. That was not something she could let stand. The next morning she rode into town. Cedar Falls was a small settlement, barely worthy of the name, but it had a telegraph office. Kimberly composed a message carefully, addressing it to Marshal William Patterson in Lincoln. Bill, she wrote, Kim Hawthorne. Need assistance, Cedar Falls. Old business. Send Jackson and Murphy if available. The reply came that afternoon. On our way. Jackson says tell the widow she still owes him a drink. Patterson. Kimberly smiled at that. Jack Murphy had been her partner for 3 years, back when they were chasing outlaws across the Nebraska territory. He had saved her life more than once, and she had returned the favor. If anyone could help her now, it was Jack. She spent the rest of the day preparing. From the barn loft, she retrieved a Winchester rifle that had been hidden in the rafters. Like the Colt, it was perfectly maintained, ready for use. She checked her ammunition, counted her supplies, and began to plan. Morgan would come back as promised. Men like him always did. They could not afford to let defiance go unpunished, especially from a woman. He would bring more men this time, expecting to find her cowed and ready to surrender. Instead, he would find something else entirely. That night, she sat on her porch in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Somewhere out there, Jack Murphy was riding hard to reach her. Somewhere else, Richard Morgan was planning his return. And here, in the middle of it all, Kimberly Jones waited with the patience of a predator. She had tried to leave the violence behind when she married Thomas. Had tried to be just a farmer's wife. content with her crops and her animals and her quiet life. But violence, she had learned, had a way of finding you whether you wanted it or not. The only choice was whether you met it as a victim or as something far more dangerous. Jack Murphy arrived at sunset the next day, riding a sorrel mare and leading a pack horse. He was older now, his dark hair shot through with gray, but he still sat his saddle like a man born to it. Behind him rode Stephen Howard, a younger marshal Kimberly had not met, but whose reputation preceded him. Both men wore their badges openly, a deliberate statement to anyone watching. "Kim," Jack said, dismounting with a grunt, "you look good. Widow life agrees with you." Kimberly embraced her old partner briefly. "Jack, thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it." Jack gestured to Stephen. "This here's Howard. Good man in a fight, steady hand with a rifle." Stephen touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, Bill Patterson sends his regards. Says to tell you the territory still considers you one of their own." "That's kind of him," Kimberly replied. "Come inside. We have planning to do." Over coffee and cornbread, she explained the situation. Richard Morgan's threats, the railroad scheme, the 3-day ultimatum that would expire tomorrow. Jack listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. "Morgan's got backing," he said when she finished. "Railroad money, probably some political connections. But he's not law, and what he's doing isn't legal." "Legal and practical are two different things out here," Stephen observed. "If he's got enough guns, the law won't matter much." "That's where we come in," Kimberly said. "I know this land better than anyone. If we can choose the ground, control the engagement, numbers won't matter as much." Jack studied the rough map she had drawn of her property. "These irrigation channels, they're all connected. Yes, I can flood the fields, create barriers, channel their movement, force them to come at us the way we want." "What about civilians?" Stephen asked. "Any neighbors who might get caught up in this? Nearest farm is 5 miles south." Kimberly shook her head. "And I sent word to town yesterday. Sheriff knows to keep folks away." "Good." Jack leaned back in his chair. "So what's the plan?" Kimberly spread a more detailed map on the table. "Morgan will come from the east, up the main road. It's the only practical approach for riders. I'll be here on the porch, visible and apparently alone. When they get close enough, I'll retreat to the barn. That will draw them across the open ground between the road and the buildings. And that's when we flood the fields," Stephen said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. The water will force them to bunch up, limit their mobility. Jack, I want you in the root cellar with the rifle. You'll have clear shots at anyone trying to flank us. Stephen, you take the hayloft in the barn. High ground, good sight lines." "What about you?" Jack asked. "I'll be mobile, moving between positions, keeping them guessing." Kimberly's finger traced paths on the map. "The key is coordination. We let them think they're winning until it's too late to retreat." They spent the rest of the evening going over details, checking weapons, and preparing positions. As the night wore on, Kimberly felt the familiar calm that came before action. This was what she had been trained for, what she was good at. For 5 years she had buried this part of herself, but it had never really gone away. Just before dawn, Jack found her sitting on the porch, watching the eastern horizon. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "No," Kimberly's voice was steady. "Just thinking about Thomas. He knew what I was when he married me. Never asked me to change, just to be careful. He'd be proud of you for defending this place. I hope so." She stood, checking her gun belt one last time. "They'll be here soon." As if summoned by her words, dust appeared on the eastern horizon. Riders, more than before. Kimberly counted them carefully. 8 men this time, including Morgan. They were taking no chances. Jack and Stephen moved to their positions without a word. Years of experience had taught them the value of silence before a fight. Kimberly remained on the porch, apparently alone, apparently vulnerable, just a widow waiting for the inevitable. Richard Morgan led his expanded group up the dusty road with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Beside him rode Gene Nelson, and Brandon Adams, along with 5 new men whose gun belts and hard faces marked them as professional killers. Morgan had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "Mrs. Jones," Morgan called as they approached the house. "I trust you've had time to consider our offer." Kimberly stood slowly, her hands visible and empty. "I have, Mr. Morgan, and I'm afraid my answer hasn't changed." Morgan sighed theatrically. "That's unfortunate, ma'am. Truly unfortunate. Eugene, would you and the boys please explain to Mrs. Jones why she should reconsider? Nelson and two of the gunmen dismounted, their hands resting casually on their weapons. The message was clear. Submit or face the consequences. Now, ma'am, Nelson said, walking toward the porch. No need for this to get unpleasant. Just sign the papers and we'll be on our way. Kimberly backed toward her front door. I told you this land isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, one of the gunmen said. Question is whether you pay in money or pain. That was when Kimberly made her move. Instead of retreating into the house as they expected, she dove sideways off the porch, rolling behind the water trough as her hand found the Colt at her hip. The first shot took Nelson in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying. What the hell? Morgan shouted, his horse dancing nervously. She's armed. The gunmen were fast, professionals who lived by their speed and accuracy, but they were also confused, caught off guard by a middle-aged woman who moved like a trained killer. Kimberly's second shot dropped the man who had threatened her, a clean hit to the center of mass that left no doubt about her skill. From the root cellar, Jack Murphy's rifle spoke with authority. The Winchester's heavy bullet caught one of the mounted men in the chest, tumbling him from his saddle. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the farmyard, followed immediately by the boom of Stephen Howard's shotgun from the barn loft. It's a trap, Brandon Adams yelled, wheeling his horse toward the road. They're everywhere, but retreat was no longer an option. Kimberly had moved to the irrigation controls, and now water began flooding the fields around the house. The carefully engineered channels filled rapidly, turning solid ground into treacherous marsh. The horses struggled in the mud, their riders fighting to maintain control. Morgan's remaining men tried to spread out, to use their numbers and mobility to overwhelm the defenders. But the flooded fields channeled them into killing zones, where Jack and Stephen waited with patient precision. Each shot was carefully aimed, methodically placed. No ammunition wasted, no opportunities missed. Who is she? One of the gunmen screamed as Kimberly's Colt barked again. Nobody shoots like that. Morgan's face had gone pale as understanding began to dawn. The tactical precision, the coordinated defense, the professional competence of their opponents. This was not a frightened widow and a few local farmers. This was something else entirely. Kimberly Jones, he called across the chaos of gunfire and splashing water. That's not your real name, is it? Kimberly emerged from behind the water trough, her weapon trained on Morgan with rock-steady hands. No, she said calmly, it isn't. The fight was over in less than 10 minutes. Of Morgan's 8 men, 3 were dead, 2 were wounded, and the rest had fled on foot through the marshes. Only Morgan himself remained mounted, his horse standing knee-deep in muddy water, surrounded by the evidence of his miscalculation. Marshal Kimberly Hawthorne, Morgan said, his voice hollow with recognition. The widow. I should have known. Kimberly kept her gun trained on him as Jack and Stephen emerged from their positions. The nickname had followed her throughout her career, earned not because she was married, but because she left so many outlaws' wives widowed. She had been one of the most effective marshals in the territory, with a reputation for bringing in her quarries dead or alive, usually dead. You should have taken the hint when I said no the first time, she told Morgan. Saved yourself a lot of trouble. The railroad will still come through, Morgan said desperately. You can't stop progress. Maybe. Kimberly's voice was calm, matter of fact. But it won't be coming through my land, and you won't be the one bringing it. Jack Murphy approached with a pair of handcuffs, his rifle still ready. Richard Morgan, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit arson, and about 6 other charges I'll think of on the way to town. As they secured Morgan and tended to the wounded, Stephen Howard shook his head in amazement. Ma'am, I've heard stories about the widow for years. Never thought I'd get to see her work. I'm retired, Kimberly said, holstering her weapon. This was just protecting my home. Some retirement, Jack observed, reminded me of the old days when we cornered the Dalton gang in that box canyon. Same tactics, same precision. The Dalton gang had been Kimberly's most famous case. 3 brothers who had terrorized the territory for months before she tracked them to their hideout. The final confrontation had been brutal and decisive, establishing her reputation as a marshal who got results. As the sun set over the flooded fields, Kimberly surveyed the aftermath of the battle. Her corn was ruined, trampled by horses and soaked with muddy water. But the house still stood, the barn was intact, and the land remained hers. Thomas would have understood. He had known what she was when he married her, had accepted that violence might one day return to their quiet life. That night, after Jack and Stephen had departed with their prisoners, Kimberly sat on her porch and watched the stars emerge. The irrigation channels were already draining, carrying away the floodwater and leaving behind rich, fertile mud. By spring, the fields would be ready for planting again. She had thought her days as Marshall Hawthorne were over, that she could leave that life behind and become just another farmer's widow trying to make her way. But perhaps that had been naive. Perhaps there was no escaping what you were, only choosing when and how to use it. The badge was back in the trunk, hidden beneath false boards and faded memories. But the gun belt remained on her hip, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. Her land, her home, the life she had built with Thomas. These were not things she would surrender to men like Richard Morgan, no matter how much money or influence they brought to bear. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the prairie on the night wind. Kimberly listened to the sound, thinking of the stories that would spread from this day. How the widow had returned, how a simple farmer's wife had faced down 8 armed men and emerged victorious. The legend would grow in the telling, as legends always did. But she knew the truth. She was not the widow anymore, that fearsome figure from territorial folklore. She was Kimberly Jones, Thomas's wife, keeper of his memory and guardian of the land they had loved together. The skills of Marshall Hawthorne had served her well today, but they were tools, not identity. 3 months later, the railroad did come through Cedar Falls, just as Morgan had predicted, but it followed a route that skirted Kimberly's property, respecting the boundaries she had fought to defend. The new railroad president, a man named Jeffrey Hernandez, who had taken over after Morgan's arrest and conviction, proved more reasonable than his predecessor. "Mrs. Jones," Hernandez had said during their single meeting, "I understand you had some difficulties with my former associate. I want you to know that the railroad bears you no ill will. We're prepared to work around your property." "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Hernandez," Kimberly had replied. "I appreciate a man who understands the value of good neighbors." The truth was that Hernandez had no choice in the matter. The story of the widow's return had spread throughout the territory, growing with each telling. Railroad executives were practical men, and none of them wanted to tangle with a living legend. It was easier to adjust their route than to risk another confrontation with Marshall Hawthorne. The spring planting went well that year. Kimberly's fields, enriched by the mud from the flooded irrigation channels, produced the best crops she had ever seen. The corn stood tall and green in the summer sun, and the wheat grew golden and heavy with grain. It was as if the land itself approved of her decision to fight. She was checking the irrigation controls one morning when she saw riders approaching. For a moment, her hand moved automatically toward her gun, but then she recognized the lead horse. Jack Murphy was returning, and he was not alone. "Kim," Jack called as he dismounted, "got someone here who wants to meet you." The woman who climbed down from the second horse was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of alert eyes and careful posture that marked her as law enforcement. She wore a badge on her vest, and her gun belt showed the wear of regular use. "This is Deputy Marshal Nancy Torres," Jack said. "Just transferred in from Colorado. Nancy, meet Kimberly Jones, used to be Kimberly Hawthorne, back when she was teaching outlaws to fear the badge." "Ma'am," Nancy said, extending her hand, "it's an honor. I've read all the reports about your cases. The way you tracked the Dalton gang, the siege at Broken Rock, the showdown with Black Pete Morrison. You're a legend." Kimberly shook the young woman's hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and regular practice with firearms. "I'm just a farmer now, Deputy. The legend belongs to someone else." Jack snorted. "Tell that to Richard Morgan. He's still in territorial prison, by the way. Turns out he had warrants in 3 states. You did the territory a favor." "What brings you out here?" Kimberly asked. "Actually, Nancy's the one with business." Jack gestured to the young deputy. "She's got a situation that could use your expertise." Nancy Torres looked embarrassed but determined. "Ma'am, there's a gang operating out of the Badlands north of here. They've hit 3 banks and killed 2 sheriffs. We think they're using the old mining camps as hideouts, but the terrain is too rough for regular pursuit. We need someone who knows how to track in country like that." Kimberly was quiet for a long moment, considering. I told you, Deputy, I'm retired. Yes, ma'am, but people are dying. And you're the best tracker the territory ever had. There was something in the young woman's voice that reminded Kimberly of herself at that age. The determination to see justice done, the willingness to risk everything for the badge and what it represented. She had been like that once, before the years and the violence had worn her down. Tell me about the gang, she said finally. Nancy's face lit up with hope. They call themselves the Iron Creek Gang, led by a man named Andrea Cox, though that might not be her real name. She's got maybe 6 or 7 followers, all of them wanted for murder. They hit the bank in Millerville last week, killed the sheriff and a deputy. The name Andrea Cox was familiar to Kimberly, though she could not immediately place it. As Nancy Torres continued her briefing, the memories began to surface. Cox had been part of a larger organization, one of the criminal networks that had plagued the territory in the years before Kimberly's retirement. She was with the Brennan outfit, wasn't she? Kimberly said suddenly. Back in 74, 75. You know her? Nancy leaned forward eagerly. I know of her. Kimberly's voice was thoughtful. Sarah Brennan ran a gang of bank robbers and claim jumpers. Cox was one of her lieutenants, smart and ruthless. I always wondered what happened to her after we broke up the Brennan gang. She went underground for a few years, Jack said. Resurfaced last spring with her own outfit, been hitting targets all across the Northern Territory. Kimberly walked to the edge of her porch, looking out over her fields. The corn was nearly ready for harvest, the stalks heavy with ears that would feed her through the winter. It would be hard to leave now at the most crucial time of the farming year, but the badge in her trunk seemed to call to her, along with the memories of what it had meant to wear it. Justice was not something you retired from, not really. It was a calling that stayed with you, waiting for moments like this. How long would it take, she asked. Nancy glanced at Jack before answering. Hard to say, ma'am. Could be a week, could be a month. Depends on how well they're hidden and how much fight they put up. Kimberly made her decision. I'll need 2 days to arrange for someone to watch my place, and I want it understood that I'm doing this as a favor, not as a return to active duty. Yes, ma'am, Nancy said quickly. Whatever terms you want. Jack grinned. Knew you couldn't stay away forever, Kim. The territory needs the widow. Don't call me that, Kimberly said sharply. That name belongs to the past. But even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true. The widow was part of her, just as Marshall Hawthorne was part of her, just as Kimberly Jones was part of her. She could not separate these identities completely, could not wall off one part of her life from another. She was all of these things, and denying any of them diminished the whole. 2 days later, she rode north with Nancy Torres in a small posse of territorial marshals. Her neighbors, Carolyn Kelly and Lauren Harris, had agreed to watch her farm and harvest her corn if she was not back in time. They asked no questions about where she was going or why, understanding that some things were better left unspoken. The Badlands north of Cedar Falls were a maze of canyons and mesas, carved by wind and water into a landscape that seemed designed for hiding. It was country that Kimberly knew well from her years chasing outlaws, but it had been a long time since she had tracked quarry through these rocks and ravines. On the second day out, they found the Iron Creek Gang's trail. Horse tracks leading into a narrow canyon, carefully concealed but not well enough to fool an expert tracker. Kimberly studied the sign with the intensity of a scholar reading ancient text. 7 horses, she told Nancy. One of them is favoring its left front hoof. They passed through here maybe 6 hours ago. How can you tell about the hoof? Nancy asked. The print is slightly deeper on the right side, compensating for the injury. Kimberly pointed to barely visible marks in the dust. And see this scuff mark? That's from a horse trying not to put full weight on its foot. They followed the trail deeper into the Badlands, moving carefully to avoid detection. The canyon walls rose on either side, red sandstone carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of erosion. It was beautiful country, but deadly for anyone who did not know its secrets. The Iron Creek Gang had chosen their hideout well. The old mining camp was tucked into a box canyon with only one entrance, surrounded by high walls that provided natural fortification. From their position on the rim, Kimberly could see the gang's horses picketed near a stream and smoke rising from the chimney of what had once been the mine office. 7 horses, just as the tracks had indicated. But that meant the gang might have grown since Nancy's last intelligence report, or that they had picked up additional members along the way. Either possibility complicated the tactical situation. We could wait for them to come out, Nancy suggested. Ambush them at the canyon mouth. Kimberly shook her head. They've got supplies for weeks, maybe months. And if they've got hostages from their last robbery, we can't afford to wait. What do you suggest? Kimberly studied the canyon walls, looking for alternate routes of approach. There, she said finally, pointing to a narrow ledge that wound down the western wall. It's dangerous, but it would put us behind their position. That's a 60-foot drop if you slip, one of the other marshals observed. Then we won't slip, Kimberly said simply. The descent took 2 hours, moving carefully from handhold to handhold along the treacherous ledge. Kimberly went first, testing each step before committing her weight. Behind her, Nancy Torres and the other marshals followed with the grim determination of professionals who understood that sometimes the only way out was through. They reached the canyon floor without incident, emerging from the rocks like ghosts materializing from shadow. The mining camp was 100 yards away, its buildings clustered around the old shaft entrance. From this angle, they could see into the main building where several figures moved around a table. Andrea Cox was exactly as Kimberly remembered her from the wanted posters. Tall and lean, with dark hair and the kind of predatory grace that marked her as dangerous. She was studying a map spread on the table, planning their next robbery with the methodical care of a professional criminal. The approach would have to be perfect. 7 armed outlaws in a defensive position with limited cover between the rocks and the buildings. Kimberly signaled for the marshals to spread out, using hand signals learned in countless similar situations. The attack came at dawn when the gang was least alert. Kimberly's shot took out the sentry with clinical precision, a single bullet that dropped him silently to the ground. The other marshals moved simultaneously, their weapons speaking in coordinated volleys that shattered the morning quiet. Andrea Cox proved to be everything her reputation suggested. She rallied her gang with shouted orders, organizing their defense with the skill of a military commander. But she was outnumbered and outgunned, facing marshals who had planned their assault with professional thoroughness. The battle was brief but intense. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as both sides sought advantage through superior position and more accurate shooting. Kimberly moved like a ghost through the chaos, appearing where she was needed most, her Colt speaking with deadly authority. When the smoke cleared, 4 of the gang members were dead and the rest had surrendered. Andrea Cox herself lay wounded but alive. Her career as an outlaw leader finally ended. The territorial marshals had achieved their objective with minimal casualties, a textbook example of how proper planning and execution could overcome superior numbers. Nancy Torres stood over the captured gang leader, her young face flushed with the excitement of victory. "We did it," she said to Kimberly. "We actually did it." Kimberly was already checking the wounded, applying field dressings with the competence of someone who had seen too much violence. This was the part that never got easier, the aftermath when the adrenaline faded and you were left with the human cost of justice. The ride back to Cedar Falls took 3 days, slowed by the need to transport prisoners and wounded. Andrea Cox, despite her injuries, proved to be an unrepentant criminal who showed no remorse for her crimes. She spent the journey making threats and promises of revenge that fell on deaf ears. "You know this won't end anything," Cox told Kimberly during one of their rest stops. "There's always another gang, always another leader. You can't stop them all." "Maybe not," Kimberly replied, "but I can stop you." "The widow," Cox said with grudging respect. "I heard you were dead. Just retired." Same thing in our line of work. When they reached Cedar Falls, a crowd had gathered to witness the return of the famous marshals and their prisoners. Word of the successful raid had preceded them, carried by telegraph and the irrepressible Frontier Gossip Network. Nancy Torres basked in the attention, but Kimberly slipped away as soon as the prisoners were secure. Her farm was exactly as she had left it, tended with care by her neighbors. The corn had been harvested and stored, the animals fed and watered, the property maintained with the kind of attention that spoke of genuine friendship. It was good to be home. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Jack Murphy rode up with a familiar expression of barely contained excitement. "Kim," he called as he dismounted. "Got news from the territorial capital." "What kind of news?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Governor wants to offer you a permanent position. Chief Marshal for the Northern Territory, with your own district and a team of deputies." Nancy Torres specifically requested to work under you. Kimberly was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. It was everything she had once wanted, the kind of position that would have thrilled the young woman who had first pinned on a marshal's badge. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the cost of vigilance and the value of peace. Tell the governor I'm honored by the offer, she said finally, but I'm not interested in returning to active duty. Jack looked surprised. Kim, this is the chance of a lifetime. Your own district, hand-picked deputies, all the resources you need to clean up the territory. I have everything I need right here, Kimberly replied, gesturing toward her fields and buildings. This is my life now, Jack. This is what I choose. After Jack left, shaking his head in bewilderment, Kimberly walked the perimeter of her property one more time. The irrigation channels gleamed silver in the moonlight, carrying water to fields that would soon be planted with winter wheat. It was peaceful here, quiet in a way that the territorial capital could never be. She had been the widow once, feared and respected throughout the territory. She had been Marshal Hawthorne, dedicated to justice and the rule of law. But now she was Kimberly Jones, Thomas's wife, keeper of his memory and guardian of the land they had loved together. It was enough. The gun belt still hung on its peg by the door, cleaned and oiled and ready for use. The badge remained in the trunk, wrapped in faded memories and old commendations. They were part of her history, tools that had served their purpose and might be needed again someday. But for now, she was content to be just a farmer, watching over her crops and animals, living the quiet life she had chosen. The territory would have to find its justice elsewhere. She had done her part, paid her dues, earned her peace. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. Kimberly listened to the sound, thinking of all the roads not taken, all the choices that had led her to this moment. She had no regrets. This was where she belonged. This was who she was meant to be. Tomorrow she would plant winter wheat in the fields where corn had grown, continuing the cycle of seasons that had sustained her since Thomas's death. The land would endure as it always had, and she would endure with it. That was enough. That was everything.